of April 1st, 1878, the servants of a Fifth Avenue mansion discovered something that would make the front page of every newspaper in America. Not because it was unexpected, but because everyone had seen it coming, and no one had stopped it. Her name was Ann Trow Lohman, but New York knew her by another name, a name whispered in mahogany-paneled parlors by women who would never admit they'd whispered it at all. Madame Restell. She had lived in that mansion for over a decade, built it with her own money, filled it with her own furniture, her own art, her own ambition. In a country that told women they could own nothing, she owned everything. And on that April morning, with a straight razor in her bathtub, she made sure that a man named Anthony Comstock would never have the satisfaction of watching her humiliated in a public courtroom. This is not a story about a crime. This is a story about who gets to define one. Because in the Gilded Age of American history, there existed a perfect and grotesque machine. A machine built from silk and scripture, from philanthropy and paranoia, from the desperate prayers of women with nowhere else to turn. Madame Restell ran the most controversial medical practice in 19th century America. She provided abortions and contraceptives to thousands of women, poor factory girls and the wives of senators alike. She was prosecuted, vilified, and finally hunted to her death by a man who called himself a moral crusader. But Anthony Comstock's crusade wasn't about morality. It never was. What we're about to unpack is the architecture of elite hypocrisy. Had the same class of people who privately relied on women like Madame Restell publicly destroyed her. How a set of laws bearing one man's name were weaponized not to protect women, but to control them. And why, 147 years later, we are still having the exact same argument. Let's establish the world first, because without understanding the performance of the Gilded Age, the extraordinary, obsessive, almost violent performance of respectability, you cannot understand why Madame Restell existed, or why she had to be destroyed. The Gilded Age, roughly 1870 to 1900, was America's first great experiment in manufactured inequality. The Industrial Revolution had produced, almost overnight, a class of men with wealth so obscene it required new language to describe it. The Vanderbilts, the Astors, the Rockefellers. These were not merely rich men. They were institutional forces, reshaping cities, buying legislatures, and constructing, brick by brick, a social mythology that insisted their wealth was deserved, divine even. And presiding over this mythology, managing it, polishing it, embodying it, were their wives. The women of the Gilded Age upper class occupied a position of extraordinary social paradox. They were simultaneously the most visible and the most constrained human beings in the city. Their bodies were corseted in Worth gowns from Paris. Their days were scheduled down to the quarter hour. Their marriages were, almost uniformly, transactional alliances, mergers between family fortunes, negotiated with less sentimentality than a railroad contract. And within this world of performance and confinement, there was one topic that simply did not exist: reproductive autonomy. A woman of the upper class was expected to produce heirs. Not too many. The truly fashionable New York families of the 1870s were already practicing what historians have documented as voluntary family limitation. Too many children was considered lower class, vulgar, evidence of insufficient self-restraint. But how these women achieved that limitation? Through contraception, through abortifacients, through the services of practitioners like Madame Restell, was never, ever spoken of in polite society. This is the foundational hypocrisy at the center of our story, and it is important that we name it precisely. The same women whose husbands would later fund Anthony Comstock's moral crusade, the same women who attended church on Sunday and signed temperance petitions on Monday, were, on Tuesday afternoon, sending their maids with discreet notes to a brownstone on Fifth Avenue. Madame Restell's brownstone. Ann Trow was born in 1812 in Painswick, England, a village in Gloucestershire. Working class, no inheritance, no connections. She emigrated to New York as a young woman, worked as a seamstress, buried a first husband, and somewhere in the early 1830s began to make a different kind of calculation about what survival required in America. By the 1840s, she had married Charles Lohman, a printer with radical ideas about medicine and female autonomy, and together they built what could only be described as a parallel medical system, one that operated in the spaces that licensed, male, respectable medicine refused to go. She advertised, openly, brazenly. In an era when most abortifacient providers operated in whisper networks and back rooms, Ann Lohman, now operating publicly as Madame Restell, ran ads in the New York Herald and the Sun. She offered consultations. She made house calls to wealthy clients in a private carriage. She employed assistants. She kept records. She ran, in the language of our own century, a business. And the business was extraordinary. By the 1860s, historians estimate she was earning what would be the equivalent of several $1 million annually. She purchased a lot on Fifth Avenue, directly across from St. Patrick's Cathedral, and built a mansion so grand, so deliberately placed in the heart of respectability, that it was itself an act of provocation. The Archbishop of New York reportedly found it intolerable. But her clients, or more precisely, her clients' wives, kept coming. This is the first layer of the illusion we must deconstruct. Madame Restell was not a criminal operating on the margins of society. She was a service provider operating at the center of it. Her existence was not a secret. It was an arrangement, a mutually beneficial, studiously ignored arrangement between a woman who understood power and a class of people who needed her to exist, but couldn't afford to admit it. Until, of course, they needed someone to blame. Anthony Comstock was born in 1844 in New Canaan, Connecticut, the son of a farmer. He was, by his own description, a man visited by an almost physical disgust at the presence of sexual material in the world. A disgust so profound, so consuming, that he spent his entire adult life constructing legal mechanisms to eliminate it. Historians and psychologists have long noted the particular texture of Comstock's obsession. He did not merely oppose pornography or abortion in the abstract. He collected it, he catalogued it, carried specimens of obscene material in his coat pockets for decades, producing them at lectures with a theatrical horror that bordered on, and many contemporaries explicitly noted this, prurience. His biographers describe a man whose relationship with the very material he claimed to abhor was intimate in ways that resist simple explanation. But what transformed Anthony Comstock from a private eccentric with strange habits into one of the most powerful censors in American history was not his conviction. It was his funding. In 1872, Comstock attached himself to the New York Young Men's Christian Association and its wealthy donors. Men like banker Morris Ketchum Jessup, who had accumulated a fortune in railroad financing and banking, and was looking, as many Gilded Age philanthropists were, for a project that would launder social anxiety into moral authority. The Comstock Laws of 1873, formerly the Act for the Suppression of Trade in and Circulation of Obscene Literature and Articles of Immoral Use, were the product of this alliance. They federalized the definition of obscenity to include not just pornographic material, but also any information about contraception or abortion. Sent through the US mail, sold across state lines, discussed in pamphlets. One man, one lobby, one law. And suddenly, every woman in America who sought information about her own reproductive body was potentially a criminal. Comstock did not write these laws in isolation. He was appointed as a special agent of the United States Post Office, a position that gave him the power to intercept mail, conduct sting operations, and make arrests. He used this power with a relentlessness that his contemporaries found extraordinary. In his first year alone, he claimed to have seized over 200,000 obscene items. He kept a personal tally of suicides resulting from his prosecutions. He recorded it with pride. By his own accounting, Anthony Comstock was directly responsible for the prosecution of individuals whose subsequent suicides he tallied at 15 or more people over his career. He did not experience these deaths as tragedies. He experienced them as evidence of guilt. Now, let us talk about the sting. By 1878, Madame Restell had been operating for over 4 decades. She had survived previous prosecutions, most notably an 1847 trial that resulted in a 1-year sentence on Blackwell's Island, which she served and from which she returned, more famous and more defiant than before. She was 76 years old in 1878. She was wealthy. She was tired, and Comstock wanted her. The mechanics of what followed are a case study in what we might now call entrapment by institutional power. Comstock arrived at Restell's door in November 1877 in disguise, presenting himself as a poor man whose wife needed help. He pleaded. He invoked suffering. He obtained from Restell certain pills and a sponge, contraceptive materials. He paid for them. He left, and then he returned with a warrant. The newspapers exploded. The New York Times, which had spent decades simultaneously running stories about Restell's scandalous practice and carefully not naming the women who used it, now published her arrest in detail. The framing was predictable. A monster brought to justice, a stain on the city, finally to be removed. Her bail was set at $10,000, roughly $300,000 in today's money. She paid it in cash, immediately. What happened next tells you everything you need to know about Madame Restell, and everything you need to know about the system that was about to consume her. She hired the best lawyers in New York. She began preparing her defense. And then, in the weeks before her trial, according to multiple contemporary accounts, certain visitors began coming to her home. quietly, without announcement. Women. Women of quality. Women whose names, it was whispered, might appear in Restell's records if this case went to trial. Restell had kept meticulous records for 40 years. Patient names, treatments, payments. She knew who had come to her, and they knew she knew. She never used that information, not once, not as leverage, not as protection. This is a fact that her harshest critics, then and now, have rarely chosen to examine. On the night of March 31st, 1878, Restell dined alone. Her husband Charles had died years before. Her daughter had distanced herself. The mansion on Fifth Avenue, so carefully constructed, so deliberately placed, it was, by that final winter, a monument to a particular kind of loneliness. The loneliness of a woman who knew too much and had chosen to remain silent, and had found that silence offered no protection at all. She drew a bath. She took a straight razor. She cut her own throat. Anthony Comstock heard the news and described it as, and I am quoting directly from historical record, a bloody ending to a bloody life. Let us now remove the personal from this story and look at the machinery underneath. Because what happened to Ann Trow Lohman, to Madame Restell, was not primarily a story about one woman and one zealot. It was the story of a class structure so fragile, so dependent on performed virtue, that it could only maintain itself through the periodic sacrifice of those it most depended upon. Here is what the historical record shows, and what the newspapers of the 1870s were extremely careful never to say in the same paragraph. The Comstock laws were funded primarily by wealthy Protestant men who belonged to organizations explicitly committed to maintaining social order, which is to say, class order. Their stated fear was not simply immorality, it was the immorality of the wrong people. The demographic anxiety underneath the Comstock laws was not subtle to contemporaries. The birth rate of upper and middle class Protestant families was declining. The birth rate of Catholic immigrant communities, Irish, Italian, Eastern European, was rising. The political implications of this demographic shift were, to the Gilded Age establishment, genuinely terrifying. More immigrant children meant more immigrant voters. More immigrant voters meant the potential disruption of a political order built around the interests of those who already had everything. The Comstock laws, in this reading, and this is a reading with significant scholarly support from historians including Andrea Tone, Janet Farrell Brody, and Amy Werbel, were not primarily about obscenity. They were a reproductive policy masquerading as a moral crusade, a legislative mechanism to encourage the births of the right children and prevent the reproductive autonomy of everyone. And here is the particular violence of how this worked in practice. When the Comstock laws criminalized reproductive information, they did not criminalize it equally. The wealthy women of Fifth Avenue continued to have access through private physicians who used coded language, through discretion purchased with money, through European travel if necessary. The architecture of elite medicine found its workarounds, as it always has. The women who bore the full weight of the Comstock laws were the women who had always borne the full weight of everything. Poor women, immigrant women, women without husbands or with husbands they could not escape, women in factories, women in domestic service, women whose pregnancies were not inconveniences, but life-altering catastrophes. These women, deprived of legal information and legal practitioners, turned to what was available: self-administered abortifacients, backroom procedures, pennyroyal tea in dangerous concentrations, instruments they had no training to use. The historian Leslie Reagan, in her landmark study When Abortion Was a Crime, documents the extraordinary rise in deaths from septic abortion complications in the decades following the Comstock laws. Women did not stop ending pregnancies. They stopped surviving them. This is the systemic anatomy of the crime that was committed in the name of morality, not the crime Comstock prosecuted, the crime he performed. And consider this final structural note before we close. The same newspapers that celebrated Restell's arrest and described her death as justice, the New York Times, the Tribune, the Herald, ran on the same pages advertisements for patent medicines with names like Dr. Peter's French Renovating Pills and Madame Drunette's Lunar Pills. These products, sold openly and legally, were marketed to women for obstructions and irregularities, 19th century euphemism so thin it was barely a veil. They were, of course, abortifacients. They were legal, because they did not say so directly, because their manufacturers had the right friends, because the architecture of respectability has always been less about what you do and more about the grammar you use while doing it. The mansion at 657 Fifth Avenue was demolished in 1881, 3 years after Restell's death. A commercial building replaced it. The progress of real estate is, as always, indifferent to the lives it erases. St. Patrick's Cathedral, the one she built her mansion to face, the one whose construction she watched from her windows for a decade, was completed in 1879. It still stands. I want to sit with something before we close. We tend to tell the story of Madame Restell as a story about one remarkable, defiant woman. And she was remarkable. She was defiant. But if we reduce this to a story about individual character, her courage, Comstock's cruelty, we have done exactly what the Gilded Age wanted us to do. We have made it personal when it is structural. The Comstock laws were never fully repealed. Let me say that again for clarity. The Comstock Act of 1873 remains on the federal books. In the years since the overturning of Roe v. Wade in 2022, legal scholars and anti-abortion advocates have begun openly discussing invoking the original Comstock Act to restrict the interstate mailing of abortion medications. The architecture Anthony Comstock built, funded by men with money and anxieties, is still standing. And the hypocrisy? That, too, is structurally preserved. The same political coalitions that restrict reproductive access for women without means ensure that their own daughters have access to private physicians, to travel, to the quiet workarounds that money has always purchased. The grammar is different. The architecture is the same. We are living, right now, in what many economists and historians are calling the second Gilded Age. A period of wealth concentration, institutional capture, and performed virtue that would be familiar to any newspaper reader of 1878. The names above the buildings have changed. The mechanism has not. Ann Trow Lohman built her mansion across from a cathedral on purpose. She understood, with the clarity that comes from spending 4 decades watching the wealthy be privately dependent on what they publicly condemn, that proximity to power is not the same as protection from it. She knew what was coming. She chose the terms. In the end, the question isn't whether Madame Restell was a hero or a criminal. Heroism and criminality are categories assigned by whoever controls the legislation. The question is this: who was she serving, and who was being served by her destruction? Madame Restell served thousands of women across 40 years. She could have destroyed reputations. She chose silence. Anthony Comstock kept a tally of the suicides that resulted from his prosecutions and called it a record of virtue. 147 years later, the laws he built are being actively discussed for reactivation. So here is the question I want you to take into the comments, and I genuinely want to hear your thinking on this. Was the persecution of Madame Restell the product of one man's pathology, or was Comstock simply the acceptable public face of an elite class protecting its own power while eliminating the evidence of its private dependency? And if it was the latter, what does that tell us about the moral crusades happening right now?